He sanded the wood, blew a little on the surface, and contemplated the winding trail of darkness on the tan wood of the keel. Definitely a crack, but the question of nature versus nurture remains. If the crack was at surface level, he could fill it with epoxy and sand it down. If the crack ran along the board, it meant the wood was simply bad, and he would have to rebuild the boat to replace the doomed part. Richard Thomas looked again at the warm, oily glow of the house lights 100 yards away as darkness began to permeate the air around him. Putting it off as long as possible, he went back to his cheerless home. Once upon a time, everything was more promising. Shortly after graduating from college, he married Karen Johnson, his high school sweetheart. She wouldn't even talk to a guy like him, who came from a dysfunctional family, but she met him at the club of their church, which preaches free markets and social justice. "Be kind to children from dysfunctional families," said her father, a psychologist. "They are more like wild animals because life has treated them harshly. Don't expect them to care about helping others, only themselves." Karen kept her distance from most of them, but as she stared into space, she happened to meet Richard's eyes. "Hello," he said to her casually. She saw a rather muscular boy with bright blue eyes and honey-colored hair, quite handsome, just above average height, an inch under 6 feet. She knew he was a bit of a failure in the class, who still got pretty good grades and built himself some kind of award-winning boat. He scared her because his father was an oil company executive, and according to her parents, they were evil people, and she knew Richard as a sharp and outspoken guy who often left behind grudges. "Hello there," she said with typical teenage irreverence. He saw a slender girl with an innocent face, unreadable gray eyes, and bright brown hair. She carried herself as elegantly as a dancer and had muscles from playing field hockey, and he knew she got good grades, but she was quiet in class, as if she was waiting for some reason to come out of her shell. An inch shorter than him, she seemed lively but reluctant to give much away to the world, although he suspected that if she ever became confident enough to have her own opinions, she would have a lot of insight. They talked for the rest of the night, covering every possible topic intertwined with predictable questions of introduction. That evening, Karen returned home in a state of deep confusion. Like most of her generation, Karen had no idea what love was or how it related to attraction and lust. She got one vision from the classic books she read in school, another from Hollywood and popular music, and a third from church and her parents. In the movie, a handsome man and a beautiful woman met in some awkward situation, then began to fight in what her psychologist aunt called a codependent relationship, but eventually fell into bed together and discovered in the morning that they were in love. The books she was given at school praised men and women who defied social pressure to remain virtuous and then met their true love and companion by doing something selfless. Her parents insisted on finding a man with a good career who would not destroy the family, but they also refused to treat her unfairly. She had never seen Richard as anything other than one of the children she would leave with the rest of the high school students, but she felt something that might have been a desire to please him, to approve of her, to even desire her. Karen and Richard met during their senior year of high school, that bittersweet time when people know that growing up soon will destroy old friendships and loves. She knew Richard scared her too. One day during a history lesson, the teacher noticed that most of the students were catatonic or asleep, and turned to Richard with a question about Hitler and Stalin. "Tyrants mistake who they are for who they could be," Richard said. "Stalin, a former bank robber, confused power with importance and turned his country into a bureaucratic dictatorship that killed 30 million of its people due to sheer incompetence. Hitler, an artist, confused his popularity with moral righteousness and started a war that devastated his country. A good leader rules for the sake of his people, not for his own power or self-esteem." The teacher wrinkled his brow. Half the class perked up. "What about war crimes, genocide, and oppression?" Richard chuckled. "History is written in cruelty and extermination because these are the only signals that awaken people. Otherwise, they simply follow their own momentum. Hitler was like Robespierre, a true believer, who ended up executing everyone who disagreed because he needed to believe that his ideology was correct." Stalin was more like Genghis Khan, a glorified criminal or Third World warlord who knew his ideology was nonsense, and as a result was able to survive it by largely sacrificing others. They are almost as bad as our current leaders who are doing the same thing to us, only slower. At that moment, Karen realized that there was something about Richard that she could not tame. She liked domesticated men like her father, who followed the rules. When her mother had needs, he satisfied them, and if he did not agree, he bit his lip and reluctantly fulfilled them. Her two parents were equals and discussed every decision together. He made Richard look like some kind of wild animal who acted purely on instinct and heart, and she knew it was impossible to control, but she also knew in her gut that he was the only man she could ever truly love. "You need to date other boys," her mother Beverly said. "You can't live your whole life with just one man. It will always be an unequal relationship in which he will have the advantage. He needs to know that there are absolute rules that he cannot break. Marriage is like marriage, a small social group where, unless you give power to yourself, you will be forced to conform to what others want." And so Karen found herself asserting herself and dating other boys. She never went beyond copious caresses. This made her more popular, and she graduated from high school on a high note. If Richard noticed that her skills had improved, he never questioned why, or at least never said anything. Richard received a full scholarship to the same local university she attended, but Karen's mother decided to explore a wider range of sexual partners. No one was fooled by her late work or girls' night out. The marriage fell apart like a sparrow hit by a space shuttle, scattering Karen and her brothers into different apartments on both ends of the city with varying degrees of lack of money. She finally understood what Richard had been through, except that because his father was an executive at a major oil company, he had more money than her parents, the guidance counselor, and the high school history teacher. She escaped the poverty and chaos in her life through her marriage to Richard. He got his first big job and kids started showing up. Daniel when Richard was still in his entry-level position, and Kaya, Robert, and Suzanne after each of his promotions. Soon they had a nice house in a decent suburb. "Are you satisfied?" Richard asked Karen one evening. "I think so," she replied. "I'm not sure that's the question. Are you happy?" "Happy," he said. "I do not believe in this." He read to her from a book he was reading, one of his old favorites that she never liked. "You're a terrible driver," I retorted. "Either you need to be more careful or don't drive at all." "I will be careful." "No, not like this." "Well, other people are careful," she replied lightly. "So what?" "They will stay away," she insisted. "It takes two to make an accident. Suppose you meet someone as careless as you." "I hope I never do," she replied. "I hate careless people. That's why I like you." "Each of us is responsible for our own happiness," Richard said. "It's a matter of responsibility to your true self. You have to make yourself good so that you can love yourself, and only then can you appreciate what life really is." She looked at him as if she barely knew him. "It seems bleak." "Not at all, just a realistic look," said Richard, lighting his pipe. "Who you are, your work, and how others see you is not who you are. You choose to become who you are. Even love is a choice. As Siddhartha would say, external events are not happy or sad, but thinking makes them so." Time passed, and they both forgot this conversation as it faded into history. By her mid-30s, Karen was managing a brood that was beginning to be mature enough to fend for itself. As parents learn, by the time children reach adolescence, your window of opportunity to teach them anything has passed. They begin to enter adulthood, even if only in the early stages, and make decisions for themselves, based in part on what they have learned from their parents to the extent that they trust them to teach. Richard went from a job where he simply did what he was told to being a business owner, which meant he spent most of his waking moments thinking about how to maneuver his company so that there would be enough money to be sustainable. Market niche where it could grow. He now had 3 employees, 2 negotiators, and an office manager. His office manager, Sue Scott, came to him straight out of graduate school. She earned a Master of Fine Arts degree in creative writing, only to discover that the insular small community that favored the next big thing in literature had distinct tastes, and she, who loved both the classics and ancient texts, her bachelor's degree was in classical languages, could not make a career in the world of the latest ironic styles and personal quirks. "What do you hope to achieve here?" Richard asked without looking up. Sue looked at him with her bright blue-gray eyes. "Mr. Thomas, I like to speak directly," she said after a few seconds. "I need a job that I won't hate. My degree is kind of useless, so I'm starting from scratch, and I want to learn practical business management skills so that one day I can open a cat shelter and prevent it from going under like most of them. A few years later, I'm here because of all the places I called. The people here seemed real, and everyone was honest with me." Richard thought about it. "You're accepted," he said. "What?" She blushed and then looked away. "No, it's not because of your, appearance. We're professionals here, and we don't do this because it would harm the other person. I warn you, I'm not a sensitive person, I'm a caveman, but I like fair play. No, you took a chance with this answer, told the truth, and seem very competent based on your undergraduate work and part-time job, so I'm betting on you." Although she started out unsure, having to learn what was essentially a new business language, she quickly mastered it once she gained confidence. Richard was not attracted to her at first, although she was an attractive girl next door, with a slender, graceful face and slender body, but when he began to rely on her daily, he saw her as smart and hardworking. However, he was committed to his marriage, his business, and his concept of fair play, which meant he didn't cross the line, especially with someone several years younger than him and financially vulnerable. "What?" she asked one day. "Sorry," he said. "You looked at me as if you wanted to say something," she said, apparently not noticing his deep, smoky gaze, which he forgot to hide for a moment. "Oh, just thinking about this meeting with a client," he said. This turned out to be fortunate because later that week she showed up with her boyfriend Alex. He was a dancer, as muscular as a boa constrictor and as agile as he could balance on one leg on the railing above their two-story conference room. Richard went home and took a cold shower, realizing for the first time the pain of temptation and the satisfaction of overcoming it. He was tested and he survived. Life went on, and he was soon immersed again in the development of his company. His first attempt to renovate the old sailboat left to him by his grandfather and caring for his children. He quickly forgot about Sue as a colleague and was grateful for that. With more free time on her hands, Karen got a job at an advertising agency where her uncle worked. The kids were already busy like adults. Sports, rock bands, art classes, ballet, debate, and martial arts after school, and then on their phones or doing homework until midnight. She started as an administrative assistant. During her second week on the job, her boss quit, and before Karen knew it, she had taken over the position. This required her to spend at least 10 hours a day in the office, but by getting up early, she could get it done, and her husband, who came home early, could cook dinner for the children. She shared her fears with her mother, Beverly. "I feel like I'm becoming two different people. One is me at home, where there's no fame, just more socks to wash. The other is my career, where I'm growing fast, and now I want to move to the city." "It's a necessary part of growing up," her mother said. "You overcame inequality as a woman, refused to let society define who you are, and now who you are matters. You're part of this economy and culture, and now you matter more than that loser you married. Get married." "He's not a loser," Karen said. "He came back and got an MBA and a law degree, and now runs a firm of negotiators. We live very comfortably." "Yes, but who will remember him when he dies?" asked her mother. "He's just another faceless face in a suit and tie. You, on the other hand, are pushing boundaries by having a job that is progressive and will soon become extremely lucrative. Your life becomes meaningful because of who you are and what you do." Beverly was still working at the same job in the school district, where she met the man she intended to be her second husband. It turned out, however, that his wife was willing to forgive his misdeeds, So he returned to her and never eloped with Bev as they had planned. She ended up living alone, but enjoyed an active social life and was featured in several local magazines for her work bringing Christian compassion to those in need. When Karen brought the casserole to her father, who lived in an apartment he could afford after alimony and child support, he expressed caution. Don't let your job become your soul. They're not worth it. You're the same with or without a job, and family is just a bonus. You'll always be my smart, loving, kind girl. Trust me, I've given too many years to work, church, and politics. I wish I could spend this time making more connections with people. If you want to be famous, write a book or something. Now Karen wandered in doubt through the catacombs of her mind. She was never the girl everyone knew and talked about, just a quiet one, although highly regarded and respected. Although Richard provided a good income and was a loving father, he was not like the men she read about in the news who were inventing new social networks, building rockets, or running nonprofits that provided microloans to starving people in the third world. Karen was promoted again when the company split in response to a potential merger. Half the staff left out of disgust at being taken over by their competitors, but for Karen the move was brilliant because it more than doubled their market share. She filled positions left by deserters. When she presented her ideas to her boss, Jeb Sheehan, he perked up, seeing the potential of her new direction of marketing, which combined sound capitalist wisdom with human rights activism, and insisted that she work with him directly. Soon she began spending more time in the office. Her family, like all organic things, adapted. Daniel did more of the cooking, as did Richard. The younger ones helped wash vegetables and clean the house. They were all proud of her, she thought, although she felt some hesitation on the part of her husband. During this period, she became close to Jeb, and they developed a close working relationship as they reorganized the bloated company into a hard-hitting team bent on market dominance. Her friends barely recognized her. Karen updated her wardrobe and spent an hour every morning on her home elliptical machine. She knew she looked like a million because heads turned when she walked into the room. The former wallflower of her school days not only broke through the glass ceiling and destroyed inequality, but also became coveted for her mind, body, and personality. Her family retreated to the level of a line in her biography. Richard watched this from afar, having seen it many times in his work. Eventually, his mother left to become an executive vice president in Bangkok, but he never told Karen about it. What was at first an inner restlessness became a heaviness, then an emptiness, and finally a perversion. He began to notice that he sometimes felt short of breath, as if he forgot to breathe, and that he often felt a cramp in his stomach. You know, Richard said one day as they cut green beans for Saturday dinner, I always try to apply the wife test at work. If I was doing something and you came in and were upset about what I was doing, I wouldn't want to do that. That even includes being behind closed doors alone with a female colleague. Oh, honey, I don't care, Karen said absently, and Richard saw her outlook change at that moment. There was no jealousy, which meant she no longer cared enough about him to possess him to the exclusion of everyone else. For love to exist, Richard knew, it had to be jealous, otherwise it was simply using another person for convenience. It's a good rule, he said. I mean, if you want to keep your spouse happy, are you happy, Karen? Karen didn't say anything. They fed the kids, watched a terrible action movie that made everyone happy with its gross action, and then went to bed. Richard pressed himself close to Karen and tried to interest her, but she turned away. Not now, she said in the same voice she used with her subordinates. She turned and, under the light of a small book lamp, began looking through a folder of documents related to her company's upcoming merger. Richard fell into a restless sleep. He knew from biology class that when a female rejected a male, it meant that she considered the other male to be of higher status and would never return to the old one unless her bet failed. Having grown up with the idea that love meant abandoning all others rather than constantly seeking the next opportunity, he found her response troubling. He fell into a restless sleep in which dark thoughts and images disturbed him. He was nowhere to be found when Karen got up, but he soon came running up the driveway. Over the next few weeks, Richard increased his runs to 5 miles a day, worked out in their home gym in the garage, and updated his old, scruffy wardrobe. On Saturday night, the babysitter showed up, and he took Karen to her favorite Italian restaurant, a movie, and a new trendy club for cocktails and dancing. She danced with him twice, then checked her phone and said it was time to go home. He was afraid of something he had seen many times before. People confused signal with action, map with territory, appearance with reality, gesture with meaning, and who they were with who they really were. The grass was always greener, he thought, because he knew the disadvantages of his current situation, but only saw the advantages of a change. On new grass, things started out well, in his experience, but then ended disastrously. He redoubled his efforts. He came to her work with flowers and noticed how her secretary rolled her eyes. He wondered what she had been told about him. He called her twice a day without exception and repeated his Saturday evening maneuvers. He lost 5 pounds, so he increased his workouts and soon saw improved muscle definition. In a desperate attempt, he bought her a necklace that she had noticed in the window of one of the jewelry stores. He felt the approach of error like a distant storm, but was powerless to stop it. In each case, she expressed gratitude, stayed for the minimum amount of time necessary to be polite, and then excused herself to do some work in preparation for the next day of work. "You've been pretty distant lately," he said one night. "What can I do to keep our marriage afloat?" He looked at her with empty eyes. He knew there were two options. She admits the problem, they work on it, and life goes on because they are united. This meant that she still believed in him, respected him, and was on his team, working towards their mutual interests. She denies the problem because she either doesn't think it can be solved or has no interest in doing so. This meant that in her heart and mind she had already left the marriage and saw it as something that didn't matter. "What do you mean?" Karen answered evasively. "We don't spend time together anymore. We barely make love, and when that happens, it's like you're waiting for a taxi. We rarely talk. I haven't seen you smile at me without a reminder, or spend time with me unless I demand it." "Since you started this job," Richard said. He knew where this was going, and to his surprise, it didn't make him angry. It made him sick, ill, and restless. He saw everything he wanted slip away like a candle melting and pouring down the drain. Karen looked straight at him. For him, it was a crisis. For her, this was a delicate situation that she had to put off, like putting off a supplier who wanted to be paid at her job. In her mind, she would eventually return to the marriage that she now believed was something she had agreed to. Right now, she had bigger opportunities, and marriage was her backup plan in case she finished enjoying all life had to offer. "I didn't notice the problem," she said lightly. "They went to bed that night in different worlds. They could be in isolated dimensions, on distant planets, or different species for whatever they had in common now." Richard wondered where he had gone wrong, and then realized that Karen had always had a crusader in her life, defending the oppressed against the powerful. By being a good husband and provider, he became a powerful entity that she rebelled against and gladly defeated. He spoke with his longtime friend, Sheriff Danville Harris, who advised his father during his divorce. "She's dancing with the devil," the sheriff said. "I've never been into religion other than to generally believe that some benevolent force created this place and is looking after us since we're basically suicidal idiots most of the time." He laughed. "I always thought that the God of the Old Testament must have had a giant bottle of Advil, watching his people go out and do nothing but make endless mistakes because their egos got in the way. At the police academy, we were told a little about Jung and Freud and ego and ID. Basically, it looked like this." The sheriff lit one of the Italian cigars he preferred, cutting it in half through the bulge in the middle with his pocket knife. "The ID makes decisions. It is essentially who we are in our instincts and souls. The ego explains what happens in response to our decisions in such a way that we look good in the eyes of ourselves and others, which is what we believe who we are. The ID is essentially a plurality of conflicting impulses, and the one that is least destructive and most beneficial, at least in theory, wins." He exhaled smoke and continued. In the academy, we were told to explain things to the ego so that the ID chooses the path of least resistance. Make fight or flight impossible, offer some food, and you can get them into the system without violence most of the time. Your wife is doing the opposite. Her ego makes the decisions, causing the ID to follow him, causing her to lose her sense of who she is. I guess the question for you, the sheriff said, lightly lighting his dwindling cigar, is whether you want to fix this. After all, she, as they say, showed you her ass. This is not just a superficial blemish, and something that went wrong deep inside her. Life is just stairs. When you go where you need to go, it's a hard climb. When you go somewhere bad, it's a jump and a jump down. Got caught on a descending staircase somewhere and can't find the ascending one. Do you think she cheated on you? No, said Richard. Not. Physically, not yet. But in her mind she is ready, and now that I know this, I will never be able to enjoy her again. My trust in her is destroyed, and the same with my respect, following her own giving up on me. She just threw away my love, trust, affection, and hope. That's certainly true, the sheriff said. When you choose another man, you tell the first man that he is not good enough for you, and this leads to two paths. Either you take him back, but despise him, or you reject him so as not to despise yourself for agreeing. Once they make a decision, in my experience, they may not be out the door right away, but they are already on their way. Yes, said Richard gloomily. Well, thanks, Sheriff. I'll think of something. The next time he saw Karen, on a night when she wasn't working late, he gently suggested that they spend more time together to keep the marriage healthy. He then tried to invite her to ballroom dancing lessons, but she refused, using her workload as an excuse. He devoted hours to foot massages, conversations, and higher grades of wine. Uselessly, in each case, he felt her contempt, realized how little he meant in her eyes, and felt the heaviness in his stomach building up to several tons of dark hopelessness and gray despair. Finally, he simply asked, "Do you want to get a divorce?" said Richard. "What?" said Karen. "Why do you ask?" "First, I want a yes or no answer." Karen returned to her reading. "No, I do not think so." "Why?" "Well, that wouldn't make sense, would it? We have kids. We have a house. We both have careers where we benefit from having spouses. And, Richard said slowly, drawing out the syllable. And, I love you, Karen said, her eyes now looking at the floor. We'll grow old together. We'll have grandchildren. We can get that lake house we've always talked about and spend our golden years there. Richard looked at her, his eyes clear. She couldn't see the tragedy there. When they were in love, she would have told him he was a big stupid idiot and kissed him. Now she treated him like one of her subordinates at work, or maybe like an unyielding supplier, and essentially reprimanded him into silence. How about meeting him halfway, supporting him, and expressing love? No, it was as dead as their sex life. Robert, age 14, gave him the next piece of the puzzle, since all of life is a mystery, and the first step in solving a mystery is to identify all the elements involved. You know that girl I was going to the fall dance with? She left me to go camping with Owen Rogers and his weird family. The one you gave the necklace to, asked Richard. Yes, just a week ago, Robert said. You know, alpha rubles and beta sex. Girls want a stable guy to provide money and a stud for sex. He blushed slightly from using his tongue. You're a nerd, but you're also a stud, Richard said, ruffling his hair. It will take a few years for it to become obvious, but some girl will realize that you are a worthy match. Do you want to come to the gym with me? We can pump you up a little. Yes, said Robert. That would be great. I noticed you've put on some muscle too. 4 miles away, a shamefully close distance, separated by social conventions that men shouldn't just show up at their wives' work, Jeb had a similar conversation with Karen. He's a good guy, a reliable husband, Jeb said. But you and I are doing something big here. This will be the first advertising agency in history to combine good deeds and big profits. We will make history. So I need you to be fully involved, if you understand. What am I talking about? Karen looked up, her gaze dry. They both knew what he was talking about. Back home, Richard fed the kids, read to Suzanne, helped Kaya with geometry, and called Daniel, who was attending the state university on a full scholarship. He decided to stop wasting time on his wife and instead enjoy his children more. When Karen returned home and went straight to the shower, taking her phone with her, he shuddered in bed. His stomach began to twist painfully again, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He barely slept that night, although Karen purred gently like a cat. When he looked in the mirror in the morning, he saw a dead seriousness in his eyes and a lack of sparkle in them, their usual bright blue color diminished to an immense cobalt. He didn't recognize the expression at first, but then he remembered it from working on a school project as a volunteer at a veterans hospital, where he met men who had seen too much war. These were the eyes of a man trying to hold on to his agony, unsure if the devil from within would break out at any moment and leave behind a devastated, bloody wasteland. "Everything is fine?" Sue asked him mid-morning. They were struggling with a new contract that would limit their schedule and possibly be unprofitable. "Er, just didn't get enough sleep," he said. "That's all. I'll grab some more coffee and get ready." She looked at him with concern. "I'll get the coffee. Don't get used to it." He smiled despite himself, and by the end of the day he had everything in place, renegotiated the contract for additional fees, and created a 6-month schedule that he could adapt to existing clients. He said goodbye and began the journey home, allowing his mind to unfocus and relax, as he had learned long ago in his Vipassana training. Then it dawned on him on 2 levels. Marriage was a love partnership, a family, and a business. He needed to approach his problem in a business-like manner and use business logic to solve it. Over the past few days, he has been researching topics about adultery. Most of them, it turned out, were simply bored and felt insignificant. This usually happened at work, which was a substitute for the sense of well-being provided by family. When self-pity and lust coincided, the desire became strong. Most affairs went unnoticed, although in his experience, this usually meant that the marriage was a zombie, a once living being now dead but reanimated without a soul. Very few affairs lasted long, although, as he noted, a person who cheated once was more likely to do it again. He also read stories on internet sites about such tragedies. He found them incredible. He couldn't imagine wanting to hurt his wife or feeling angry. He had pain instead. A deep pain resonated throughout his body, pulsing through his eyes and fingertips with every breath he took. It was just a tragedy, an insoluble tragedy. He also found stories of reconciliation unrealistic and overly emotional. What was broken and could not be repaired. "Dad," Kaya met him at the door. He looked up and saw 3 pairs of eyes of his children watching him carefully. They knew, he realized. They always know, he thought, remembering how he felt the inner pain and anxiety when his mother returned home late, and when he looked up and caught his father's gaze, seeing the same dull seriousness and steadfastness there. People in pain see life in terms of diminished possibilities, he realized, so his first step was not to do it. The second was to take care of my children. When Karen returned home late, she walked into an immaculate home. 2 large pizza boxes were in the recycling bin, homework was done, and the kids were in bed. She couldn't find her husband, at least not until she looked at the backyard. There he was, by the light of a Coleman lantern, sanding that old boat. She turned on the kitchen light, knowing she would be illuminated by the full-size windows. He looked up but didn't wave. She went to sleep. On Friday morning, he came home sweating from a run. Karen was just getting ready to leave. Richard," she said, as if she had suddenly remembered something. He felt the ionization of the air between them. "I forgot to tell you, I'm going on a business trip for the weekend," she said. He nodded. There was no point in telling her not to do it. She's already done it in her mind and heart. He knew from his readings that the act of cheating occurred at the moment when the cheater psychologically demoted his spouse to the level of a person who needed to be deceived, manipulated, and directed. Almost all of them saw it as something owed to them or compensation for past wounds, and so they weren't just using their spouses. On some level, they hated them, even if they couldn't admit it. Richard believed that society exists on two levels, corresponding to the ego and the ID. The ID consisted of his repressed desires left over from nature, but the ego explained them to itself as something good and not bad. When he heard someone say, "We are all equal," his mind translated it as, "I am first." When they talked about patriotism or free markets, it meant, "And others serve me." He thought Karen was different. He loved the shy, sensitive, and perceptive girl he first met at that church gathering on their first date. He didn't mention this to her for a while, adhering to the code of fair play that he and his father shared, as he didn't want to embarrass or manipulate her. He wondered if he had always been wrong, or if something had finally caught up with her and pushed her over the edge. "Is there something I should know?" he asked softly. "No, Richard, nothing," she said, looking annoyed, then got into her car and drove off. Nothing. This was the feeling that descended on his soul, an eternal and endless emptiness where nothing mattered except the sensation of the moment. He wanted to become one with the void, clear his mind of everything and exist only in that crystalline structure of logic, where every detail was in its place, forming lattices of knowledge, each level dependent on the lower one. He wanted to separate himself from emotions, sensations, desires, and, most importantly, the awareness of who he was and what situation he was in. "Dad," Suzanne asked, looking into his eyes. Richard returned to consciousness. The work was over, and he had managed it somehow, and now he was home with his children. The clarity of his inner world, connected to the outer world beyond his immediate concerns, was a great refuge. Emotions returned to him quickly: anxiety, the feeling of watching the tragedy from afar, and a heavy, deep sense of loss. "This too shall pass," he reminded himself, and turned to his daughter. "Are you okay?" she asked in her thin, trembling, childish voice. "Now that you're here, I'm wonderful," said Richard. He went to work. He did it well. He was brilliant, even inspired. He put all his nervous energy and growing sense of despair into the work, and the results were good. Now he had to take care of his little ones, having an hour or so after work to clear his mind. Then he looked at his watch. "And I was late for dinner," he said. "It's pizza time again, kids." There were cheers, and they settled in for a few rounds of some hopelessly violent video game for boys, while Kaya Reed and Suzanne watched the animated movie again about the duck who saved the world with a chainsaw, or something like that. Richard was a little distracted. The local pizza delivery guy already knew them well, mostly because Richard had thanked him well for not chatting, and after a fun pizza party, he put everyone to bed. Homework can wait until Sunday. The next day they went to the zoo. Robert, a little too big for this, politely walked through all the sections and lingered in the reptile house. Kaya was fascinated by the birds, and they circled the outdoor cages 3 times. Suzanne tried to see all the lions, tigers, bears, and otters, her favorites, but then she began to act up, and after being pacified with cotton candy, she fell asleep in her father's arms, sending his shoulder into a deep sleep as well. Then it was time for playing in the backyard, throwing an old foam football and playing games until dusk. Richard remembered his college days and prepared a dinner of hot dogs, bell peppers, spaghetti, cilantro, and tomato sauce with sour cream to make it like an Alfredo. They then read or played video games around the fire he had built in the pit in the backyard until Richard went back to sanding his boat. He looked out over the long backyard that stretched to the water of the fourth canal they lived on. In a city riddled with waterways, he could understand the value of owning one of the luxury homes in prominent lake communities, but he knew everything had to be paid for. Here they could lead a normal life, know other normal people, and be both aware of their unique abilities and humble, enjoying others and their contributions. He knew that everything he did was for the children, and if it killed him, he would not allow them to live the way he lived. Richard never saw himself as a victim. He saw the challenges thrown his way and entered his meditative state and understood what was really happening. How does the situation work? By understanding the structure, mechanism, and process formed by the relationship between action and consequence at each level, he could bypass it or make it work for him. He sighed, feeling mature and perhaps older than he was this morning. Student Richard, the guy with the shocking haircut, big muscles, and lust for life, would look at this quiet existence and laugh, then crush a few more cans of Milwaukee's best and go on another escapade. Or maybe not. Somewhere inside Richard knew that he had always wanted this. He distrusted greatness and preferred an ordinary life in which his mind was clear, so that if he discovered an opportunity for some great invention or moment in history, he could seize that day without mental confusion. On Sunday, they went to church. Richard knew in his gut that he believed in God, even if he did not trust any book written by man, because he understood cause and effect. The sky is dark at night. However, dark skies can be caused by weather, a solar eclipse, or even the final battle at Harmageddo between the forces of order and fire. However, if the world as a whole was good, only one thing could cause it, and in the depths of his heart Richard had long ago found and loved God, even if he hated organized religion as much as he despised politics and social media. He didn't call his wife. Monday started bright and early, and he took the kids to the local Korean Montessori school, which was less Montessori and more classical education with a modern twist. When he went to school, the staff room smelled of coffee and cigarettes. Some hippies were good, just as some oil company executives were decent and honest people. In this world, everything was more complex than even emotions. Richard chatted amiably as he ran off to work, then worked hard at his keyboard, telephone, and filing cabinet for about 10 hours before returning home. Sue looked at him with some caution, but he responded with a slightly absent smile, conveying pleasure in what he was doing and determination. When you are a boss, you must lead your people for their good, and if you must deceive them, it must without exception be in their interests, even if they do not understand it, he thought. Speaking of tyrants, his wife returned home late, when dinner was already on the table, announced that she had eaten, and went into the shower. The children exchanged knowing glances. Richard looked at his children, a mixture of his wisdom and their mother's indomitable intellect and passion, and knew that they would not be fooled. "Listen, guys," he said suddenly, out of breath. "You know I love you, right?" They nodded, their bright, wet eyes looking at him. "I will always be here for you, and so will Mom," Richard said. "If you trust me, don't worry about anything. We'll get through this." Surprisingly, it worked. Children, creatures of an age of innocence that fades almost invisibly, like the skin of an onion, trusted the firm word of an adult who seemed to have a plan. He helped them with their homework, helped them with algebra that he didn't know he remembered, and then he put on his old lost fishing hat and went to the boathouse. He wanted to look at that keel again and saw with new eyes how the crack could have been something the original builders hadn't noticed, maybe a knot in the wood or some deep rot. He made a mental note to buy a replacement, then began to dismantle the boat. Maybe he could do some extra oiling and sanding of the replacement to make the seals tighter. As he walked toward the trash cans with an armful of dead wood, he heard Karen on the phone. She was looking into the living room, not noticing his presence, so he stopped to rearrange the pile of wood scraps he was carrying. "When I came back this morning," she said, turning slightly. She stopped. He looked up and saw her eyes in the mirror on the wall leading into the living room. She looked straight into his eyes. I mean in the evening," she continued loudly, going into another room, leaving what she was cleaning in the kitchen. At that moment, it all started. Richard leaned forward, the wood crumbled around him, and he vomited onto a small concrete area where trash cans stood. He vomited once, twice, 3 times, spilling a mixture of half-digested food, soda he unwisely drank at work, and stomach acid. An eye so acidic that he could hear it fizzing and crackling as it spread across the concrete. With an empty stomach, he wiped his mouth, then took the hose and sprayed the concrete. Picking up the rotten wood, now smelling faintly of phosphoric and hydrochloric acid, he tossed it into the trash can, then weakly slammed the lid shut. Until this moment he had his suspicions. Now he knew in his gut, but had no proof. He wasn't even sure he wanted them or that it mattered, but the part of him that was rigid about fair play insisted. He pondered these thoughts as he walked up the stairs. However, as soon as he entered the bedroom, He ran to the toilet, expelling even more of the contents of his digestive tract. The vomit twisted him so much that tears flew out of his eyes and he fell to the floor. Strangely, he did not feel sick. He simply vomited with great force, throwing the foul-smelling liquid into the toilet. He didn't feel bad, but rather unreal, unsteady. His condition was closer to seasickness or motion sickness or heartache, he realized. Mumbling something about how he felt bad, he took a pillow and went to the sofa. Soon he was fast asleep. The day went surprisingly well. He did a lot for a man who was worried that his life was being torn apart. He drank extra water all day, did a good job, smiled every time one of his 3 coworkers walked by, and came home early to make dinner for the kids. They had a great time until Karen returned home, at which point Richard rushed into the bathroom, water in his eyes and drool coming out of the corners of his mouth. He vomited like a man suicidal, his body jerking back and forth, causing bright spots in his vision and dizziness. This time the guest room offered no shelter, so he gathered some blankets and took the key to the boathouse. A simple house, it was designed for boat storage and had double doors, its own air conditioning and a refrigerator for the boat beer parties he once hoped to host. He fell asleep on the old sofa, which he inherited from his grandmother, wrapped twice in blankets, shivering not from the cold, but from the icy horror that came from within. The next morning, he waited until she left for work, then took the children to school and arrived at his office. He told Sue he would be working remotely, grabbed some files and a laptop, and turned to leave. "Do you remember your rules about fair play, Mr. Thomas?" said Sue. "And how are you supposed to do what's right for people, even if they don't understand it?" She handed him her car keys. "I heard something, Mr. Thomas," she said. "I hope that's not true, but if it is, you'll want to know every terrible detail, won't you? Like all your friends said, Richard takes the pain. So take my car, tank full, and do what you need to do. She doesn't have it. Finds out." He stared at the keys. "Thank you, Sue. I owe you one," he said, handing her his keys, unable to meet her eyes. "The hell with it," she whispered when he left. He drove her little Honda to an upscale mini mall, sandwiched between a school and a church, where there were 2 real estate agencies and an old colonial house with one-way mirrored glass that housed an advertising agency. As he parked at the church, he pulled out his binoculars and then wrote down the license plate numbers of the cars in the parking lot, along with their license plate numbers and descriptions on his legal pad. He recorded the times of their arrival and departure. Luckily, the office didn't have a gated parking lot, so when Jeb walked out, Richard could clearly see Karen getting into her car. He took some photos with Daniel's old camera. Once they left, he did nothing. The traffic light system kept them in place, so he waited a couple of minutes before driving out and almost catching up to them at the next light. Staying a dozen cars behind, he used binoculars in one eye to know when they were honking. He drove a block forward, turned into an alley, and saw them in the distance, catching up. He knew this part of the city well enough to guess where they were going, to the old Bayou Ridge Inn at the edge of the woods. "That's where I'd go if I wanted to have a sad romance," he thought. Finally, the little Honda pulled into the parking lot, and he got the shots he wanted. The 2 kissing in the car, going into a hotel room, and leaving an hour later. He let them leave, then drove lazily back to the office. They were just going inside. He saw Karen lift her head and look around as if she sensed something, but then she walked through the door. He thanked Sue again in his heart for having the foresight to provide him with an anonymous car. After sending the children to bed, Richard began his nightly ritual in the boathouse. If he stayed too long in the main house, he began to feel nauseous and his mouth and eyes filled with saliva. Once he was in the quiet of the boathouse, the waves washed over the small beach 20 feet away, and he could sleep soundly on the huge, sturdy couch his grandmother had bought decades ago. It seemed to him that she was still looking after him, hoping that everything would work out. What Karen thought about all this, one wonders. Her husband vomited violently in her presence, did not spend time with her on weekends, and seemed to ignore her affairs. They hadn't had sex before her affair, but after that it fizzled out, partly because her husband started vomiting as soon as he saw her. It took Richard several months to process what had happened and begin to confront it. One of the bookmarked links on her computer described how to basically shame or humiliate your man. You destroyed his confidence, forced him to know and accept your betrayal, then stopped all affection, but commanded him on daily issues. He would adjust over time, she promised. The article left a bad taste in his mouth. Written by some purple-haired brat with a masculine face and wild eyes with 3 sides of white visible behind her thick glasses, the article had a gleeful tone. Men, the article said, had been killing, enslaving, and controlling women for centuries. It's time to strike back, apparently by killing the good ones. She enjoyed the manipulation and humiliation. At that moment, Richard realized how truly dead and gone his marriage was, because no one who loved him would treat him like that. It was abuse, and his wife was the abuser. He recalled a school counselor warning boys about men who wanted to be their friends. Anyone who does something that is not in your best interest, but serves their own, is not a friend. He is a predator or a parasite, or at least someone who wants to use you, and that's not love. That's never love. Get away from that person as quickly as possible. A story that is rarely told in matters of adultery, whether sexual or simply a failure to respect the spouse who constitutes the absolute emotional and moral connection that makes a marriage work, is a story about children. How does this affect them? Let's take a photo. Robert, Kaya, and Suzanne called Daniel at the college to tell him what happened. "Daddy lives in the boathouse," Robert said, irritated by how thin and cracked his voice sounded. "Mom spends all her time at work, including nights, especially nights, and she often goes on business trips." Daniel sighed. "I was worried about it," he said. "Mom always had self-esteem issues because she rushed to get married and missed out on what her friends were doing. Hanging out in college like in the sisterhood of the traveling trousers, having lots of boyfriends, traveling to little villas in Italy like in Under the Tuscan Sun, having adventures like in Eat, Pray, Love. She acts like she's living in The Handmaid's Tale or The Hunger Games. I think she's worried that she's not getting enough attention in her life." "She's not here for us," Kaya said. "We have to look for her to talk to her, and she's always not home." "All my friends' moms are home at night and on weekends," Suzanne chimed in. "But she's just not there. It's like she abandoned us." Daniel thought about it. "What does Daddy say?" "He always says he'll never leave us," Robert said. "He's always there. When we go to bed, he goes to the boathouse and sleeps there." "Trust my family to be totally weird," Daniel said with a laugh. "Well, they have problems, but you have a dad. It's not much different from what happened to Davis and Shelley when their mom left the gym for a trainer, or when Christina's mom ran away to live with her boss, or even in the house Jake's, where his dad found a new girlfriend and his mom lives in an apartment near the mall." "What should we do?" asked Kaya. "Do," Daniel thought. "Welcome to adulthood, kids. Other people will disappoint you. Dad won't. He's too honest and generous. Mom might come back from her little adventure, but it's probably like when Roger's mom ran off with the preacher and then came back. Everything will not be the same. Or like Kara's parents, who opened a relationship and are now just roommates. Or, how our neighbor started dating her therapist, and when she returned, she and her husband were just roommates, without love. For Dad, and as soon as you can, get out of here, go to college, or join the Air Force or something." "What is an open relationship?" asked Suzanne. "I'll tell you later," Kaya quickly answered. "Later, when you're 18, she thought. "Thanks, Dan," Robert said. "We can handle this on our own." It sounded more mature than he felt. On the canal, Richard finally launched the boat. He replaced the keel and a lot of planks, but the old sailboat was shiny and had beautiful wood grain. He redesigned and rebuilt the cabin, replaced a faulty motor that he suspected had simply died from metal fatigue, and headed down the canal to catch the wind on the lake. He recalled an old myth. The ship in which Theseus and the youth of Athens returned from Crete had 30 oars, and was preserved by the Athenians down to the time of Demetrius Phalereus, the old planks being replaced by new and stronger ones, so much so that this ship became a constant example among philosophers for the logical question of things that grow. One side argued that the ship remained the same, and the other argued that it was no longer the same ship. Plutarch, Theseus. He had replaced several boards in his life, but it was now more waterproof than ever. He wasn't going to drown because of the decisions of someone who clearly didn't care about him anymore. Although the old boat was only 16 feet long, he rediscovered the joy he had experienced sailing with his grandfather and later with his father, and found that the old skills quickly returned. Karen returned home after another hard day at work. Despite what Jeb had told her years ago, the workload had not decreased and her firm had not risen higher than it had been. The press bombarded them with articles about their charity work in the Third World, but the money didn't come in as quickly as she expected. Her head was starting to hurt, but she wanted a drink. Instead, to her surprise, she saw Richard sitting at the kitchen table. "Richard," she said. "How?" "Pills," he said. "The doctor found something that interrupts the gag reflex. I went to doctors for years, and they were puzzled. One finally asked if I vomited at night, and I said no. He found out that if it doesn't happen during sleep, it's in the head, not the stomach. They did an MRI, and it was terrible, but there were no tumors. It's just psychological. This drug stops vomiting for a few hours, so we can talk." "So," she said, "what are we talking about today?" "Nothing special," Richard said quietly. "The kids are gone, so it's time to think about the future. We're both gaining seniority. It's time to protect our assets. The documents in front of you are the creation of a corporate trust in our names that will manage our assets and protect us from legal liability. Especially considering that your firm is playing close to the legal limit and the rumors are getting thicker, believe me, we need isolation. Have your lawyer look at it and return a signed copy if possible." She looked at the documents, skimming them quickly. It was indeed a legal trust registered in their state, with their attorney as one of the trustees. "Thank you for asking how I am," Richard said. "I'm still living in the house on the boat and having a great time. You wouldn't recognize the place with all the renovations I've done there. It even has its own mailbox." He waited to see if she would understand the meaning of this. "I don't know if I need this," she said, looking at the documents. "We're fine the way we are. I'll sign, and if I do, I'll need to start taking my income out of the family finances and putting it into a trust. That will leave you with just your salary. Remember, this includes our pension plans, so it protects those too. He will also pay the children the income from the trust, probably not enough to live on, but enough to give us a little boost in life after we die." "Okay, I'll show this to my lawyer," Karen said. "Thank you," said Richard. With that, he left. He returned to his usual relaxed office work. Sue waited 6 months to make her move. Richard had just completed the final account of one of their oldest clients, and when he turned, she was standing in the doorway, illuminated by the early afternoon sun streaming through the window. She looked nervous, her fingers trembling a little on the folder. "Sue," Richard said, "what can I do for you?" "I'm glad you're back," she said. None of them needed any explanation. Over the past months, it seemed that they knew each other like old comrades. She could predict his thoughts, and he knew her vocabulary, the words she liked to use, what their use implied, and how they reflected her confidence in any given action, and she seemed to do the same for him. If only he had met her first, he thought, but that was impossible, and he would never get his children back. No, it was just a dream, an impossible dream. "Yes, what's done is done," he said. "Actually, I just got over it. People on the internet said I would have rage, but I had sadness. They told me I would drink a lot of bad whiskey, but I still think that this will taste like cough medicine. People said you'll never get over it, but if I have any kind of revenge, this is it. I got through it. Everything I do now is for the sake of the children." "So what about you?" Sue asked, raising an eyebrow. She was very happy that her old boss was back. "An old horror movie," he said, then chuckled at her shocked expression. "Movies, Sue. I like the old horror movies from the 1960s to the mid-90s because after that it was like the Blair Witch Project or M. Night Shyamalan. Karen hated them and said they scared her, like when her parents fought when she was a child, so I just stopped watching them. Now I'm catching up. He told her about the boathouse, the big screen TV with surround sound, and other details he was implementing as he shaped his life after Karen. But why did you come to me? Sue blushed. I'm looking for new business, she said. It's complicated. The potential client was once in a merger with another firm, but now that the merger has partially fallen apart, may be open to new business. However, their former business partner wanted this segment of their business. So I'm wondering if it's possible to offer my own name, although technically the two companies are still connected. Richard looked at her with typical male bewilderment, she thought. They perceive the world literally, as if everything is a mammoth that needs to be hunted, or a saber-toothed tiger threatening the tribe in a cave. Only men could invent fire, she realized, but then they would burn everything in childish joy and then just discuss different ways to use the flame. If the client agrees, he said slowly, and the merger is really dead, I'd go for it. But when he looked up, she was no longer there. After work, back at the boathouse, he cut down a tree and thought about the conversation. What did she mean? Gradually, it dawned on him. He felt a new sensation in his stomach, a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Did she really mean it? But if so, he suddenly stood up, then sat down and replayed everything in his mind. 30 minutes later, he set the table for dinner for his children and grabbed his car keys. He turned to the children with a guilty face. Go, said Robert. No matter what you did, you haven't looked alive for, I don't know, weeks. And then he burst into tears. Richard held him close and vowed that he would control his emotions for the sake of his children, innocence on the altar of sacrifice caused by an act of serious abuse of what he considered a good marriage. As night fell and the birds gave way to the sounds of insects and the soft sound of sprinklers turning on, he turned the corner of the sidewalk leading to an apartment on the west side of town. The Sheffield apartments took up most of one of the dreariest alleys he had ever seen, but it was a safe area and quiet. He checked the address on his phone and walked to an apartment on the west side of the large, sprawling complex. She opened the door before he knocked. "Did you get my message?" she said. "I'm stupid," he began apologetically. "But you came anyway?" she asked. "Why?" "Hope," he croaked. "When we first talked, it became clear to me that you were someone and not something. There was just vitality, honesty, and direction. One door closed, you opened another. You walked in there with courage and told me the honest truth. At that time, as I now understand, I was surrounded by liars. I was impressed and still am. And then today, I try to never be frivolous with employees, especially because I'm married, but it's over, except for providing stability for my children, whom I love more than anything in the world," he finished in a whisper. Richard shook his head to clear his thoughts. "I was hoping, not believing, that you were asking me what I would do in your situation. You were conveying the message, unless I was mistaken, that I wouldn't be the bad guy in this equation. And I hoped, until I was sure, that what you said, if that's what you said, makes sense." She handed him some kind of drink. He took a sip. It was an imitation of Dr. Pepper from Costco, which is better than the real thing. He took another sip. "Thank you," he said. "What's done is done, and no matter where I go wrong, I'll never know if I went wrong at all. Sometimes things go wrong. A storm comes, and the chicks fall out of the nest, and you find them the next morning when it's too late. God's guidance or the aimless material universe. I don't know, and I don't think it's my purpose to know. But damn, I'm talking, you've always been on my mind, like one of the most genuine people I've ever met." "What about Karen?" she asked. "What about Alex?" he asked. Karen sighed. "And now you're making me admit to lying from the start. Alex isn't interested in women, if you know what I mean. He's my ballet instructor, which I do as a hobby because, well, I like it, I guess. I asked him to help put out the fire in the office because I saw the way you looked at me that time, and I knew, and I didn't want to be the other woman." And just like that, hope goes away. "I see," said Richard. "I guess I got it all wrong." "No," she said. Everything has changed. I won't call your wife a fool. She made a choice and knows what kind of person you are. She's gone, Richard. And frankly, I could go and hit the stupid bitch, but I believe in the old saying, never don't interrupt your enemy when he makes a mistake. She took the drink and took a long sip. So I don't, Richard began, furrowing his brow. No, said Sue. I've known for months. I think you know too. He took a step forward, then pressed his forehead to hers. Hope, he said, she'll kill you every time. Not this time, she said, taking his hands. Not for my life. They were talking about something, and he woke up on the couch, sitting next to her and holding her hand. It's unusual, but I'm a conventional girl, she said. The last 1,000 years, maybe more, have been a mistake. There are no rules for this, but if you don't mind going slow, we could do it. They held hands the whole time. Hours later, he turned off the engine and slowed the car, risking parking on the street so as not to wake anyone. It was the most magical night of his life. From the depths of darkness to the heights of the mountains, bathed in the sunlight of the morning spring, and not a single kiss. He held her until it was clear what had been done, and now they were conspirators in a mission of hope. Missions of faith lost in a world of people drunk with power and obsessed with death. Could this work? He fell asleep thinking about it. She set the rules. Never in the office, never in public, and never in front of his children. They will be a secret, but she was, as she put it with a fierce look in her eyes, which was reminiscent of her Norman and Scottish ancestors, all in. A moment later, he said the same thing, speaking clearly so that no one his beloved, the wizards of time, the gods of the grove and field could mistake its meaning. The choice was eternal, he realized, and any moment could change everything, like the moments that destroyed his marriage. You could retreat from the abyss at any time, but this abyss, he felt, was only dark on the outside, but full of light on the inside. They met in the evenings, after the children had gone to sleep, at his rapidly improving boathouse. He liked to cook for her, but sometimes they just sat and talked. He learned her story, a shy girl with honey-colored hair who wrote well but never fit in, and learned that she had a black belt in Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. She revealed things about him that Karen had never thought to ask about, like how he spent a summer with the volunteer fire department in the Pine Woods. Their personal vocabulary developed, and so did their attachments. One evening, sitting on the couch and holding hands, they both knew it was time. There were no words. They got up and went to the bedroom, where he covered her with kisses. Eventually, he found the courage to confess his feelings to her. It happened in a weird way, but I love you, Sue Scott. She burst into tears and ran away from the house on the boat. He ran after her, but she raised her hand, which meant she needed time, and then drove away. Lost, Richard returned to the boathouse. How could he hurt her with something he believed was positive? She was absent from work, not cold or distant, she was just not there. He divided his time between work and sneaking glances in her direction. Questions filled his mind, and he tried to maintain control. Sometimes good guys don't win, he remembered his father saying. When the workday was over, he stood up slowly and mechanically walked towards the parking lot. There he sat in his car for several minutes, trying to understand what was going on in his head, or perhaps his heart. He drove home to feed the children and pretended to listen to stories about football and math lessons, the boy who pulled his pigtail, and the diorama of the Battle of Hastings. When they fell asleep, he habitually crept up to the house on the boat. She stepped out of the shadow of the wall into the light. I can't do this, she said. It's like having a secret life that no one else can see. I can never be who I want to be, your wife and the mother of your children, and no one will see who I am inside and why this choice is important to me. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close to his warm body and rocking her gently as she cried. The next day, work was the same torture as the previous day. When Sue returned from lunch, she found a flower pot on her desk, one purple flower peeking out from the tattered, sun-scorched leaves. Most women would probably think it was a mistake and throw the poor plant in the trash, but Sue knew her new lover's language and instead went to a corner of the store. In front of her colleagues, she replanted the plant, scattering the soil on the table, then trimmed off the dried parts and watered the remaining ones. She put it in the light, cleaned up, and returned to her work. As Richard walked into the parking lot in the evening, aimlessly but slowly as his children were waiting for him at home, he felt her presence before he saw her. "If you want to leave, I understand," he said, surprised at how much it sounded more like a growl than the gentle tone he had intended. She came out from behind the column. "It doesn't fit in my head," she said, "but in my heart, yes. I love you, Richard Thomas, but inside I'm all torn to pieces." Again he hugged her. To know words is to know when they convey nothing but mush. He was sorry, he understood, he was afraid for her, he was crushed. Instead, he simply held her and felt her pulse through her skin. The next day, he stopped at her desk an hour before lunch. Without a word, she followed him, and they got into the car. He drove carefully towards a rather shabby church at the far end of town. A good-natured man with graying hair over a cassock walked out of a door decorated with stained glass. "So, this is her," he said, spreading his arms. "She's everything I could have dreamed of. How are you, my dear?" Richard sat in the sanctuary, looking at the place behind the altar where generations had worshipped. Father Muller poured her tea in his office, speaking quietly the entire time. About Richard and the divorce a long time ago, about a family so broken that he set aside 2 plots in the cemetery, and then about the man that young man became, fighting every step of the way, hiding it all from everyone, accepting pain and drawing strength from it. "I don't know what to do," Sue said. "My heart is inclined to one side, and all my practical knowledge tells me that it is impossible." Father Muller nodded slowly. "If you were on a deserted island, thousands of miles away from everyone you know, with no hope of salvation, would you be with him?" "Of course," said Sue. "Then tell me," he said, "what do you think marriage really is?" Sue hesitated. "It's a lot of things. It's a bond for life. It's a promise. It's a legal contract, I guess, as well as a contract with, God." He chuckled. "I don't know why he brought you here. I'm a terrible, heretical priest. I spend most of my time reading Buddhist theories and old Greek literature. I don't agree with the idea that we show our faith to God by doing pious and charitable deeds, and so we earn our place in heaven. I think we do this by making difficult decisions like this and doing what turns out to be best for everyone in the material world, since God put us here for a purpose, and in my opinion, that is to develop souls through suffering, including such choices." The priest blew on his tea and continued. "They call my view sola fide, or faith alone, which means that faith is not in charity, but in right thinking. If your heart is pure and your mind is clear, you will do the right things here on earth, and that too will be right in heaven. We cannot show God our faith, but we must live it. This is the difference between love and a marriage ceremony. Life is random, and there is no plan, and how we deal with it shows what we are inside." He quoted, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from you, it is God's gift. Not from work, so that no one can boast." Ephesians 2, 8-9 inches. In other words, it's good to have religion, but when it replaces practical, realistic thinking, it's a mental illness, he said. "We can guess what heaven wants, but it is obvious that you two love each other very much and should be together. This creates a conflict between the ego, or your sense of self-worth as measured by others, and the ID, or your inner desire to not only love this man, but to possess him. But the ego is associated with boasting, and the ID knows only true faith." Father Muller took a sip of tea and continued, "This means that if in your heart you love this person forever, you are married in the eyes of God. I think you are already married, by the way, and the rest of humanity can shove their opinions away. Besides, I have a few suggestions. How can you get around this situation?" Later, after thanking Father Muller, she joined Richard in the sanctuary. They returned to the office together. Sue broke the silence. "You're right, he helped clear things up for me. It's my pain of not having a big white wedding where my family will finally see me as something more than a loser and all my friends will ooh and ah, and I will finally feel like someone who made me afraid. Time moved forward. The plant in her office grew, was replanted several times, and eventually became a small bush in the corner. Every night, Richard took care of his children, then went to his newly cozy boathouse and slowly loved Sue tenderly. He bought her an emerald and diamond ring, made a new group of friends who knew her as his wife, and set up a business by purchasing the condominium where she lived with their rapidly growing family. That weekend, he and Robert went out on a boat looking for fish, as his son called it in his early childhood, causing endless jokes from his father and his fishing friends. "I never want to get married," said Robert. Richard chose his words carefully, as he often did, knowing that children remember every comment, casual or deliberate, from their parents, often for a lifetime. When he interacted with his children, Richard understood that he was not just Richard, but first a parent, a general, or a dad to his family, and he needed to do things right every time. "Marriage is the hardest thing I've ever done," Richard said. "This is also one of the best things I have ever done, if not the best. I got you as a result of this, and you are not many copies of me in my mind, but your own people who bring the best of what your mother and I had." "But Mom is never home," said Robert. "It's like you're not married at all." "I love your mother and always will," Richard said. "She made some choices that, well, it's hard to predict how things will work out in the long run made things difficult. I will always love her and forgive her, but her choices have consequences." Robert looked at the fishing line in the water. "Is that why you live in a house on a boat and Mrs. Sue comes over at night?" "You'll never fool them," Richard thought. "Yes," he said. "She's a good friend." "Will she become our mother?" asked Robert. "No," said Richard. "It's a little unusual, but I think most lives are like that. They're normal, and you have to deal with the difficulties that arise. She's my friend, and your mother is your mother. She will always be. We will be a family, but like your mother has your needs and desires, so do I." Robert thought about this for a while. "Okay," he finally said. "That makes sense. So now I have two moms." "Yeah, basically," Richard said, reeling an empty can covered in seaweed around his hook. At this, they laughed and sent the boat back along the canal to the house. Robert went to see his friends, and Richard returned to his little house on the water with the destroyed house behind him. "So this is what you were doing," Karen began, approaching the boathouse. Richard was polishing that stupid sailboat, as busy as he always seemed to be with it, although I must admit that it was further along in repairs. "It's nice that you're interested in what I do," Richard said, lighting his pipe to keep it lit while he applied another coat of oil to the wood drying in the sun. "This boat has been rotting in a barn for many years and may have always had some, how should I say, internal flaws, but I threw out the parts that were never meant for it and replaced them with new wood." "I signed the document," she said, throwing it towards him. "My lawyer Rodolfo said it was pretty standard and a good way to protect our money, but thought the corporate liability clause was strange." "What about us donating 10% of profits to the Arboretum?" Richard was surprised, but left his gaze protected. At such moments, his eyes regained the sparkle they had before he learned of her infidelity. "No, about the point about morality, and even more about the need for contribution," Karen said. "It seems like you're hijacking my salary and 401. "The trust only works if we put our entire fortune into it," Richard said. "I put everything I earn into it, just like I did with this marriage." "That's why I signed it," Karen said. "But I asked Rudolph to add a clause that any personal purchases I made would be made from my earnings before making the deposit." Richard thought about it. "If the same applies to me, I agree," he said. "So we're equals and everything." He had anticipated her demand, after all. "Okay," she said as she left. "Just put your initials on the changes." She congratulated herself on yet another successful business meeting, but in the back of her mind was the thought that Richard was, after all, a professional negotiator. Richard released a steady stream of green into the grass, then stood hesitantly to grab the hose. 10 years have passed. When Suzanne left for college with the intention of studying compiler design and machine learning, Richard felt a great sense of pride. All four of his children went on interesting paths. Robert, to his surprise, joined the Marine Corps and set out to obtain professional certifications in HVAC and to manage networked SCADA systems for warehouse climate control. Kaya received a scholarship to a private college, and Daniel opened his own plumbing business for luxury homes and corporate rentals, making more money than he knew what to do with. Suzanne was starting high school. One sunny day, Karen rushed towards the boathouse in a rage, then stopped. What was the procedure? She knocked on the double doors. Finding them unlocked, she entered, clutching a thin folder in her hands. "What in God's name?" she gasped. Someone replaced the old creaky boards with new ones with grooves for joints, and then covered everything with drywall. It had a small bathroom, albeit with a composting toilet and wiring for electricity. It had an office nook, a kitchen, a nook for a bed in a former loft, and the coziest men's corner she'd ever seen, with leather sofas angled toward the TV. The full-size refrigerator, she checked, was filled with meat, beer, and the occasional vegetable, which was probably suffering from self-esteem issues. Did he party here? It looks like it. Karen felt a moment of abandonment. The irreparability affected her self-esteem. She was no longer important to her husband. When she noticed women's clothing, bras and panties in the dresser next to the corner bed, she instantly knew she had been replaced. Even more, this small space, the size of a two-car garage, seemed more cozy and welcoming to her than the house had been in many years. He even framed the drawings each child had made at school and had photographs of herself and the children on outings she didn't remember being invited to. There was a quote on the wall. "I advise you to be careful, although never fearful. Be very careful with what you drink, with other men's women, and with the third thing, with men and their temptation to steal." Havimal 131. She heard the boat motor pull up to the dock, and her husband got out, then walked along the boards of the dock that sounded new instead of the faded, rotten boards that had been there for years. "Oh, hi," he said as he walked through the door. "So, do you like the place?" "Very beautiful," Karen said dreamily, then snapped back to reality. "What the hell is this?" she said, shoving the folder in his face. "Adoption papers for your secretary's children." "No, Sue is my vice president, not my secretary," Richard said slowly. He tried to make his next statement as gentle as possible. "They are also my children, but now they will bear my last name and become part of our family so they can have their share of the trust." "You had kids with that stupid bitch." "What the hell?" Karen stopped mid-sentence. "Exactly," said Richard. "You left me, so life went on without you." "Consultation," Karen snorted. "I want," but fell silent again. He handed her the card between his first two fingers. "We have a meeting scheduled for this Wednesday." Richard turned to the table, taking everything he had out of his pockets, and remained there until he heard her high heels stomping away and then running towards the house. On the lake, night fell slowly, as always, and the fireflies came out to play in the long grass, far enough from the noise of the roads to survive. A few days later, Richard found himself driving to a large house in the center of the city. It had once been a family home, but like many organic things, it had been replaced by commerce and the inexorable march of progress that Richard no longer trusted himself to define, and it was now an office where a consultant rented space. "I am Dr. Raoul Winslow, and we are here with Mr. Richard Thomas and his wife, Mrs. Karen Thomas. This is being recorded for the protection of my clients and, myself. Now," there was a knock on the door. Richard opened it. "I'm Nick Randall, Mr. Thomas's lawyer," said a tall man in a smart suit. "I'm here at the request of my client to protect his interests and explain some of the things that are happening here." Karen looked back at the other three in the room. She chose Dr. Winslow, a Catholic traditionalist with feminist leanings, because of his record in protecting women by supporting men's commitment in marriage to reconciliation at all costs. Now the psychiatrist looked confused. "Karen is here," Richard began slowly, then changed course. My wife discovered that I had been living with another woman in our backyard for the last 10 years and had 3 children. Holy cow, Dr. Winslow said, then regained his professional composure. And you didn't tell her about it because she was busy and didn't notice, Richard said. His lawyer, Nick, began handing out copies of photographs taken outside the motels, each with a date and time. There were quite a lot of them. Did you know this whole time? Karen asked in disbelief. Richard gave her a look of pity. When you love someone, you know their mood. You even know when they stop loving you and only keep you around to finance the house and children. Nick spoke quietly. After discovering the affair, my client placed his and his wife's income and retirement portfolios into a trust to protect them from events of this nature. On page 3 of the agreement is a morality clause stating that any party to the agreement who engages in publicly disgraceful activities loses his share and receives only a nominal payment of $25,000 per year. Dr. Winslow looked puzzled. But if you knew about the affair, Nick said, he knew she did it once, not that she would do it again. When she repeated the process, my client admitted that his wife had lost her share, and even more that she had broken the covenant behind the trust. As she continued live in the house and spend the income from his earnings on personal needs, he handed over a piece of paper documenting many purchases. My client admitted that, in fact, she intended for the contract to remain in force, with the exception of the marital fidelity clause. He took a deep breath. This gave my client the legal right to seek a similar, partnership for himself, and he began a relationship with Miss Sue Scott, with whom, as mentioned, he has 3 children, and he is now seeking Mrs. Thomas to agree to their adoption so that they could bear his surname and be considered children of the lawful marriage in the eyes of the state. His decision to create the trust turned out to be prescient, because we have reliable information that Mrs. Thomas and Mr. Sheehan used company funds to carry out their long-term affair. Dr. Winslow turned pale, as this was not going at all as he had expected, and like most psychiatrists, he knew little more than his textbooks had taught him, even if he considered most of it to be clever talk. After all, more than a century of psychotherapy has led to more mental illness in society as a whole, not less, but he would never say that to his clients. Let's take a step back, he said in a voice usually reserved for children in kindergarten and very crazy. Richard, did you notice that your wife was cheating on you, and instead of trying to resolve it, you took revenge? No, doctor, said Richard. I tried several times to talk my wife out of infidelity. I worked out, updated my wardrobe, tried to take her out to fancy restaurants, tried to get her to talk to me, got massages, but nothing worked, despite my supposedly legendary language skills. When it became clear that the affair was not one and done, but a permanent replacement for me in the role of spouse, I considered this part of the agreement void for myself and found my replacement for the absent and unaffectionate Mrs. Thomas. Nick spoke again. During this time, my client documented the process of leaving Mrs. Thomas. He purchased replacements for his toiletries, clothing, and personal items, then renovated the boathouse to make it a second home, after which he only visited the main house to cook for, clean for reading to children and communicating with them. Nick handed Dr. Winslow another piece of paper. This is a copy of my client's application for a second address for the boathouse, establishing that it was a second residence. Mrs. Thomas apparently did not notice or care that he no longer received any mail at the main house, nor that his items never changed location. I also have a photo of his toiletries with different expiration dates from almost 10 years ago. We're getting ahead of ourselves, Dr. Winslow said. Karen, you need your lawyer to look at this document. However, we are here for marriage counseling. Is there any way you two could resolve the situation, like having a nice dinner together? I can't, said Richard. Can't or won't? Asked Dr. Winslow. I can't. I have a weird stomach problem where when I'm around her I vomit constantly and violently. It's debilitating, and the meds to suppress it make me feel disgusting for days. They seem to be hard on the liver. What about meeting outside the house? Winslow continued, desperately trying to find a way out and still bill for the full session. He also had a sailboat, and as they say, boats are holes in the water into which large sums of money are thrown. How about a vacation, somewhere tropical? Richard thought for a moment. If I take a leave, will you sign the adoption papers? He nodded to Nick, who like a professional didn't let his smile show from his soul to his face. Yes, said Karen. Then we agreed, said Richard. True to her word, Karen signed and notarized the paperwork, and the adoption process encouraged by Sue Scott, who understood the complexities of Richard and his situation early on, began its slow grind through the creaking gears of an expensive but mysteriously underfunded bureaucracy. Richard left the plane ticket under her pillow. He thought about putting away all the old, expired toiletries and clothes, many of which hung loosely on his frame, but were constricting his new large biceps and calves, but he shrugged. Instead, he went to the pier and lowered the boat onto the canal. Karen found the ticket later and smiled. Maybe this will all work out. She can have it all at once. When she got to the airport in the morning 2 days later, Richard was nowhere to be seen. Confused, she went through security with only a cursory examination of her body cavities and took a seat near the exit. The hours passed, and when the flight began to board, she began to get nervous. Standing up, she turned around. "Jab," she said, "it's so nice to meet you here." "Karen?" he asked. She looked down and noticed that he was holding an identical ticket. "I found it on my desk," he said. "I thought you wanted to finally take that vacation we've always talked about." Karen smiled warmly. "Let's go," she said. To hell with Richard and his little games, she thought. She'll make Rodolfo deal with him when she returns. Holding hands, they boarded the plane. The fish weren't biting on the canal, so Richard went back and changed his clothes. He called Nick. Throughout the day, calls were made to clients whose list Karen had carelessly left on her laptop. Each call went like this. Lawyer, legal department. How can I help? Nick. Hi, this is Nick Randall from Malhern and Rankin. I'm calling about our upcoming litigation against the advertising firm where Jeb Sheehan works, and wondering whether your firm was aware of an ongoing affair between Mr. Sheehan and his subordinate, Karen Thomas, in which we intend to investigate allegations of misuse of client funds. Were you aware of the extramarital affairs between these two, and did you ever notice any accounting discrepancies in their accounts? Lawyer, I have to find out. We will contact you. He didn't receive a single call back, but the message was delivered. Later, at the end of the day, Nick and Richard found themselves in front of the board of directors of Jeb's advertising firm. Nick started. It has come to our attention that Mr. Sheehan has been engaged in an affair with his subordinate, Karen Thomas, for over 10 years. We have found documentation on Mrs. Thomas' computer that suggests there may have been mixed means, if not the direct use of company funds, to finance this affair, including luxury weekend trips. We intend to file a claim for damages to Mr. Thomas's business caused by the revelation of this affair and the subsequent loss of trust that led to potential clients avoiding the firm, with testimony from witnesses. According to several accounts, Mr. Sheehan and Mrs. Thomas conducted this affair openly in the office, which we can only assume the firm and therefore the board of directors agreed to. We are wondering if you have an initial settlement offer. As he said this, the secretary entered the room and whispered in the ear of the chairman of the board of directors. Richard could only assume that this was yet another client who had called off, as everyone involved was trying to escape the legal storm of steel and feces that was fast approaching them. The chairman turned white, then red. "We'll get back to you," he said. Richard and Nick let them walk out the door. "Message delivered," Nick said when they were out of earshot. 2 weeks later, when Karen returned home, she was in a bad mood. On the second day in Tahiti, emails from their legal department arrived reprimanding her and Jeb. No one lost their jobs, but it was also clear that their careers would go nowhere after this failure. By decision of the board of directors, Jeb was no longer in charge of his own company. Jeb raged and ruined the rest of the vacation, calling lawyers and grumbling about how they can't do this to him. He then called his wife to explain himself, and Karen went to the beach with a cocktail. Keep serving, she told the cabana guy. Please. She handed him a 50. As soon as the plane landed, Jeb disappeared. Karen never saw him outside of work again. The next morning, Nick and Richard, wearing matching suits, ran into Jeb and his lawyer. We intend to file a libel suit regarding the allegations made against my client, the lawyer began. Great, Nick said. And what's more weight, what? Asked the lawyer. You're new to this, Nick said. I've been doing this for decades. You sue us, we get the right to discovery. First, we need Mr. Sheehan's schedule, his expense reports for all business travel on the dates we specify, and access to interviews with all employees who could have heard Mrs. Thomas and Mr. Sheehan discussing the affair in the office. The lawyer turned pale. We will contact you. Meanwhile, Karen was looking for work, but discovered that every advertising firm in North America had received a letter of solicitation asking about the details of her affair with Mr. Sheehan and the possibility of commingling funds or using company funds to finance their meetings in Las Vegas, Paris, New York, and Atlantic City. Unsurprisingly, no one was willing to hire her for any position above cleaning, and that was only if she took a rigorous ethics course, which she had to fund herself. Richard walked easily through the house and handed her the check. That's your $25,000 for the year, he said. The house is free and the children are supervised. Please. After recovering from her shock, Karen followed him down to the boathouse with a determined face. I never thought you were so immature, she said. Are you destroying me instead of trying to work it out like adults? I tried, Richard said quietly, tying up the boat. You may remember, I spent a lot of time trying. You didn't want to listen. So, are you ruining my life? Richard threw the rope aside. Let me tell you something, Karen? On our wedding day, I looked into your eyes and saw the path to happiness. Love, family, work support to pay for it all, a lake house, retirement, and traveling the world, then spending golden years in satisfaction and joy, visiting grandchildren and spoiling them. This was what I wanted. He continued, this is everything you can never have, through your own fault. You treated me like a servant or one of your office subordinates. You threw away our love, and with it our future. There are an infinite number of ways to betray your spouse, but the worst of them is contempt. You treated me like an enemy. All I did was tell the truth so that the world would know that I am not a cuckold, a man who will take it lying down. Their eyes met for a moment. Karen realized that she had never really trusted him, because who could trust a reckless animal that no woman could control? Richard saw years of crying children, frightened by the breakdown of their family, and the confidence with which Karen ruled as a tyrant, empowered by her career. Anger flared for a moment. To hell with it, he thought. To hell with Hitler, and to hell with Stalin too, and to hell with everyone who lied for power, including every American leader since March 16, 1861. Richard sighed and lit his pipe. I'm not a martyr, Karen. As a wise man once said, there was only one true Christian, and he died on the cross. I may be Siddhartha under his body tree or Odin hanging upside down with an eye missing. I am the one who learns from my mistakes. Your actions deprived me of what I wanted, so I looked elsewhere, but I refuse to divorce you because our children, the products of our love, deserve a whole family and the knowledge that they were not a mistake, even though your actions signaled to them that I was a mistake, and therefore so was their creation. As if on cue, a bright white sailboat, much larger than his small boat, approached the dock. Sue waved, surrounded by her children. I forgot to tell you, Karen, but you never asked. We're retired. Sue now runs her own consulting firm, and I do consulting. Since you didn't want to wait to travel the world, I'll go with her and the kids, and we'll have a great time. Let's spend time paid for by the trust. But this is not revenge. This is simply getting your life back after betrayal. Richard took a deep breath. I forgive you, he said. I have no resentment, no hatred, no anger towards you. I just don't care. I forgave you, gave up on you, and shut down. Despite all your attempts to become what you thought was important, you became unimportant, and your ethical violations are your own problem. He stood up and walked towards the sunset, surrounded by water swelling with summer rain. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.